240 drones lifted off first, and that was not the attack. That was the question Iran asked, out loud, to every radar operator and every interceptor battery in the theater. How much do you have, and how fast will you spend it answering me? And while every defensive system in the region was formulating its answer, 270 missiles were already in the air behind them. I am watching this unfold right now, and I need you to understand something that changes how you see everything that follows. The drones and the missiles are not two weapons. They are one sentence, and the sentence is not finished yet. 240 drones lifted off first, not in a single direction, not from a single point, from dispersed positions across multiple axes simultaneously, each package timed with a precision that did not emerge from haste or desperation, but from a planning architecture that has been stress-tested, revised, and refined across years of doctrinal development. And what strikes me, what I am watching with the specific weight of understanding what this sequencing means, is that the drones are not the attack. The drones are the diagnostic tool. They are the instrument Iran is using in real time to read the depth, the geometry, and the remaining capacity of every air defense layer between the launch points and the targets. And while every radar screen in the theater is lighting up with 240 contacts, while every interceptor battery is calculating engagement solutions, while every command center is making the first of the triage decisions that will define the next several hours, 270 ballistic missiles are already ascending from their launch points behind the drone wave, following approach vectors that were designed around the response pattern that the drone wave is generating right now. Stay with me, because the complexity of what I am describing is not academic, it is operational. And understanding it is the difference between seeing a large attack and seeing what this attack actually is. What this attack actually is a single coordinated instrument built to answer one question with devastating precision. At exactly what point does the defending architecture run out of the capacity to stop what is coming? Iran is not firing missiles blindly. Iran is firing a diagnostic salvo designed to locate that point, then target it with the rounds that are already in the air. I need you to hold that understanding as we go deeper. Because the most important revelation in this scenario is not in the first impact. It is in what the first impact was designed to reveal. Let me take you into the opening minutes of this strike with the granular attention they require. The drone wave arrives across the defensive perimeter first, 240 contacts, spread across a front that stretches the geographic coverage of every radar system tasked with tracking them. Some of these drones are carrying warheads, some are not. The defending operators do not know which is which at the moment of initial track. The signature profiles are deliberately similar, engineered to force the defense into treating every contact as a lethal threat and committing interceptors accordingly. The lower-tier batteries, the systems designed specifically for exactly this kind of engagement, begin working through their engagement sequences. Each intercept is a success in the narrow tactical sense. Each intercept is also a round removed from a magazine that will not be replenished before the next wave arrives. The mathematics of this exchange are not abstract. Every interceptor costs money, time, and strategic depth. Every drone costs a fraction of what any interceptor costs. Iran has designed this ratio deliberately. The cost exchange arithmetic of this engagement is negative for the defending side from the first trigger pull, and it is getting more negative with every passing minute. But here is what I need you to see, and this is the layer that most analysis misses entirely. The drones that are not being intercepted, the ones that the overtaxed lower-tier systems cannot reach fast enough or cannot prioritize against the higher threat contacts being tracked simultaneously, these drones are doing something beyond their nominal strike function. They are carrying passive sensors. They are mapping the electromagnetic environment of the defensive architecture in real time. Every radar that illuminates a contact reveals its operating frequency and its position. Every interceptor that launches reveals the location of its battery and the direction of the engagement corridor. Every communication relay that activates to coordinate the defensive response reveals a node in the command network. This data is flowing, in real time, back to the strike coordination architecture that is managing the missile salvo still in transit behind the drone wave. The missiles are being targeted not against the positions Iran knew about before this engagement began. They are being targeted against the positions the drones are revealing right now. That is the design. That is the sophistication, and it is working. I want to be precise about what this moment represents, because precision is the only thing that does it justice. What is happening in this scenario is not a large attack. The framing of large attack is inadequate and misleading, because it centers the analysis on scale rather than on architecture. Scale is visible. Architecture is the thing that matters. And the architecture of this strike, the dual-wave, dual-purpose, diagnostically driven, magazine depletion-targeted strike package that Iran has executed in this fictional scenario, represents something qualitatively different from anything that the air defense infrastructure of this theater has been operationally tested against. The true target of this strike is not a building, it is not a runway, it is not a command center, though some of those may be struck as well. The true target is the defending side's confidence in its own ability to maintain protective coverage through the next phase of this conflict. Because the next phase is what Iran is actually planning for. The current engagement is the preparation for the engagement that follows, and the engagement that follows will begin from a position in which the defending side's magazine depth, its radar coherence, and its command architecture's decision confidence have all been measurably reduced from where they stood 48 hours ago. Ask yourself what changes when a defending commander knows, not fears, knows that the protective coverage over the population and infrastructure they are responsible for is shallower today than it was yesterday. Ask yourself how that knowledge affects the decisions they make. Ask yourself how it affects the decisions of the political leadership above them, who are now managing a crisis against a threat landscape that is more dangerous than the one they were briefed on at the beginning of this scenario. The strike is not over. The strike will not be over for hours. And the most consequential damage it is inflicting is not yet visible on any satellite image. There is a dimension of this scenario that I have not yet addressed, and it is the one that carries the heaviest strategic weight. Let me bring you into it now. The combination of 240 drones and 270 missiles does not just create a quantitative challenge for the defending architecture. It creates a categorical challenge. The two systems operate in different kinematic regimes. Drones are slow, persistent, and numerous. Ballistic missiles are fast, high trajectory, and terminal. They require different interceptor systems to engage. They impose demands on different tiers of the integrated air defense network simultaneously. And critically, they compete for the finite command bandwidth of the human operators who must coordinate the entire response in real time, under electronic interference, with incomplete track data against a timeline that the attacking side controls. The human bandwidth problem is the second layer, and it is more dangerous than the hardware problem. When a command center is simultaneously managing 240 drone engagements across the lower tier and 270 ballistic tracks arriving through the upper tier, the cognitive load on the operators and commanders responsible for the integrated response reaches a point at which the quality of individual decisions begins to degrade. Not because the operators are undertrained, not because the commanders are incompetent, because the human nervous system and the institutional decision processes that govern military command are not designed to maintain full cognitive performance under sustained, multi-domain, high-density threat saturation for the duration of an engagement of this scale. Iran's planners know this. The design of this strike package, the specific combination of drone saturation at the lower tier and ballistic saturation at the upper tier, arriving in sequence but overlapping in their engagement demands, is calibrated to the known performance limitations of the human command architecture, not just the hardware specifications of the interceptor systems. This is a doctrinal insight that took years of study and modeling to develop, and in this scenario, it is being applied with ruthless operational precision. The second wave of missiles, and I need you to understand that what is currently in the air is not the complete picture of what Iran has prepared to launch, is being held back specifically for the moment when the command bandwidth of the defending architecture is at its maximum compression. The timing of the second wave is not based on a clock. It is based on a reading of the defensive system's real-time performance, fed by the sensor data the drone wave is currently collecting. Iran is not guessing when to fire the follow-on salvo. Iran is waiting to be told by the battlefield itself. Step back with me for a moment, because to see this attack for what it is, you have to see the years of architecture that made it possible. The drone program that produced 240 operationally deployable systems capable of simultaneous launch from multiple dispersed positions did not emerge from a single development decision. It emerged from an iterative process of design, testing, operational use in other theaters, assessment of results, redesign, and retesting that has been ongoing for more than a decade. The systems in use in this scenario are not the first generation. They are not the second. They are a mature generation of platforms whose performance characteristics have been refined specifically in response to the defensive systems they are being used against. Systems whose publicly available performance data, whose electromagnetic signatures, whose engagement protocols have all been studied with the same rigor that a military institution applies to the development of its offensive capability. The missile force tells the same story of patient, disciplined development. The solid-fuel mobile launchers that produce the 270-round salvo in this scenario can be positioned, fueled, and readied for launch without the extended preparation window that earlier Iranian ballistic systems required. The window that satellite surveillance and airborne sensors could detect and that intelligence agencies could translate into warning time for the defending side. In this scenario, the launch preparation cycle is compressed to the point at which the first warning the defending side receives of the impending strike is the missile plumes themselves. The warning time, measured from first confirmed launch detection to first terminal intercept requirement, is measured not in hours but in minutes. And those minutes are not equally distributed across the defending architecture. The naval dimension is simultaneously active. Iran's surface and subsurface assets in the Gulf and the maritime militia forces operating under Iranian direction in the surrounding waters have adopted positions in the preceding 72 hours that represent a meaningful shift in the choke point geometry of the Strait of Hormuz. No shots have been fired from that direction. No overt threat has been issued, but the positions are observable. And every tanker captain, every shipping company risk officer, and every maritime insurance underwriter who is observing those positions is drawing the same conclusion. The cost of transit through this corridor has just increased, and it will remain elevated until the strategic situation resolves in a direction that none of them can currently predict. The electronic warfare architecture supporting the strike is operating on a separate layer that I want you to think about carefully. The jamming in this scenario is not designed to completely blind the opposing defense network. A defense network that is completely blind stops producing the data that the strike coordination architecture needs to optimize the follow-on waves. The jamming is designed to degrade, selectively, precisely, and in a manner calibrated to introduce maximum confusion into the engagement decision cycle while preserving enough signal for the passive sensors in the drone wave to collect the data they need. This is jamming as a precision instrument, not jamming as a blunt suppressor. And it requires a level of electronic warfare discipline and electromagnetic environment modeling that represents genuine operational sophistication. Look at the totality of what I am describing: the drones, the missiles, the naval positioning, the jamming architecture, the follow-on timing. This is not an attack. This is a coordinated, multi-domain, systemically designed operational framework that has been built around a single objective: to reach the moment at which the defending architecture's capacity to maintain full coverage intersects with the moment of Iran's maximum offensive pressure. And in this scenario, that moment is approaching. I want to address the opposing side with the precision it deserves, because the narrative of this scenario is not about a weak defender being overwhelmed by a strong attacker. That framing is wrong, and it obscures what is actually strategically interesting about this moment. The Israeli air defense architecture in this fictional construct is genuinely formidable. It is multi-layered, technologically advanced, operationally experienced, and resourced at a level that reflects both the severity of the threat environment and the depth of the alliance relationships that support its sustainment. The Iron Dome tier has demonstrated intercept rates in operational conditions that no other short-range air defense system in the world can match. David's Sling represents a mid-tier intercept capability that fills a gap in the defensive architecture that previously existed. The Arrow system provides the long-range, high-altitude intercept capability against the ballistic threat that is now descending through the upper atmosphere. Each of these systems is performing in this scenario. Each is doing what it was designed to do. And the architecture as a whole is managing a threat load that would overwhelm the defensive systems of virtually any other nation on Earth. But there is a difference between performing and winning. And that difference, in this scenario, is becoming visible in real time. The performance of each tier is producing a drain rate on its magazine that, projected forward across the duration of this engagement and the follow-on engagements that Iran has prepared, produces a trajectory that the defending side's command architecture is now calculating with growing concern. The question they are answering right now is not, are we stopping the missiles? The question is, how many can we stop in the next engagement when we begin it from a position that is already shallower than where we started today? The political dimension compounds the military one in ways that the hardware specifications cannot capture. Every decision to escalate the military response requires political authorization from a government that is simultaneously managing domestic pressure from a population under sustained ballistic attack, diplomatic pressure from allies who are applying their own calculations of risk and exposure to the question of how deeply they want to be associated with the military response, and strategic pressure from the awareness that every escalatory action it takes is being observed and interpreted by actors who are not in this conflict yet, but who are deciding, based on what they observe, whether and how to enter it. That decision cycle, political, not military, is the deepest vulnerability on the defending side, and Iran is applying pressure to it not just through the missiles and the drones, but through the sustained nature of the engagement, which is designed to keep that pressure continuous rather than giving it the moments of resolution that the political system needs in order to re-equilibrate. The strike is now entering its third hour in this scenario, and the escalation architecture is expanding in every direction simultaneously. The air defense network is managing the ongoing engagement while simultaneously trying to reconstitute the magazine depth that has been depleted in the first 2 hours. Resupply is happening. It is always happening, because the logistical infrastructure supporting this theater was built with exactly this kind of sustained engagement in mind. But it is happening at a rate that does not fully compensate for the expenditure rate the engagement is imposing. The gap between consumption and replenishment is the number that every commander in the theater is watching most carefully right now. Because that gap defines the window of vulnerability, the point in the future at which a follow-on Iranian salvo will find a defense that is less capable than the one it is currently confronting. The maritime picture has deteriorated significantly. Commercial vessels that were transiting or staging for transit through the Strait of Hormuz in the hours preceding this engagement are no longer moving in the ways their previous track patterns would have predicted. Some have anchored. Some have diverted. Some have simply stopped broadcasting the automatic identification system signals that maritime traffic monitoring systems use to track their positions. A decision that is itself a data point about the degree of concern their operators are experiencing. The insurance market has not waited for the situation to resolve before repricing. War risk premiums for the Gulf corridor have moved to levels that reflect a fundamental reassessment of the baseline security environment of this theater, not an incremental adjustment to an elevated but manageable threat level. When premiums move that far, that fast, the economic signal they send is not just about shipping risk. It is about the insurance market's assessment of the probability distribution for regional stability across a time horizon that extends months beyond the current engagement. Oil prices have moved violently and without restraint. The speed of the move reflects something beyond simple supply disruption risk. It reflects the market's repricing of the entire framework of assumptions about the Gulf security environment. Assumptions that have underpinned the pricing of energy assets, infrastructure investments, and geopolitical risk premiums for decades. When that framework is revised in a single session, the price move is not just about today's supply. It is about every future supply decision that will be made against a revised risk landscape. In capitals across the region and across the world, emergency sessions are convening. The conversations happening in those sessions are not about the current exchange rate of missiles and interceptors. They are about the next exchange. They are about what the defending side's magazine depth will look like when the follow-on salvo arrives. They are about whether the alliance commitments that have been made in the preceding period remain fully operative under the conditions this engagement has created. They are about the domestic political sustainability of positions that were staked out against a threat landscape that looked meaningfully different 48 hours ago. And Iran, which designed this engagement to create exactly these conditions across all of these dimensions simultaneously, is not rushing. Let me dedicate the full attention this moment deserves to the weapon architecture itself. Not as a catalog of specifications, but as a window into the doctrinal thinking that produced it. The combination of drones and ballistic missiles in a coordinated, sequenced strike package represents the operational answer to a specific doctrinal problem that Iran has been working on for years. The problem is this: how do you generate sufficient simultaneous threat density against a multi-layered air defense architecture to exceed the architecture's aggregate engagement capacity without requiring a missile inventory so large that its acquisition and maintenance represents an economically unsustainable burden? The answer, as rendered in this scenario, is elegant in its logic. You do not need enough missiles to overcome the defense by sheer weight. You need enough missiles, combined with a sufficient drone saturation layer, to ensure that the defense must allocate its interceptor capacity across more simultaneous engagements than its magazines can sustain at full engagement rate. The drones handle the lower tier and consume the lower tier magazines. The missiles handle the upper tier and compete for the upper tier interceptors. The electronic warfare suppresses the radar coherence that the whole architecture depends on, and the timing sequence is optimized to ensure that the pressure on all three tiers peaks simultaneously rather than sequentially, preventing the defending side from shifting interceptor capacity between tiers as the engagement evolves. This is not a brute force solution, it is an architectural solution. And it is the product of an institution that has had to solve a hard problem with constrained resources, which historically produces better solutions than the same problem addressed with unlimited resources.
The air front and the sea front opened at the same moment. Not in sequence, not one after the other in the way that every crisis management template in every allied capital was designed to handle. Simultaneously. 230 drones ascending into the radar picture, while 310 missiles leave their launch points while Iranian naval and maritime assets reposition across the geometry of the Gulf in ways that the commercial shipping world has not seen before and is not equipped to process. And I need you to understand something right now, before we go any further. Washington is watching this. Washington is watching all of it. And Washington cannot decide fast enough. Stay with me. Because the reason it cannot decide is the most important part of this entire scenario. The air front and the sea front opened at the same moment. I am watching this unfold in this fictional scenario with a specific, pressing awareness of what simultaneous two-front activation means at the strategic level. Not just the operational level, not just the logistical level, but the decision architecture level. Because the crisis management systems that govern the American and Allied response to events in this theater were designed, implicitly and in some cases explicitly, around the assumption that a major escalation in one domain would precede a major escalation in another. That the defending side would have the luxury of sequencing its response, managing the air threat, then turning attention to the maritime threat, then addressing the political and economic dimensions in the order they emerged. That assumption is being destroyed right now. 230 drones are ascending from positions across multiple axes simultaneously. 310 ballistic missiles are in the air behind them, following approach vectors that were calculated in advance of this engagement and optimized against the track data that Iran's persistent surveillance architecture has been collecting for months. And in the waters of the Gulf, along the choke point geometry of the Strait of Hormuz, Iranian naval assets and the maritime militia forces operating under Iranian strategic direction are repositioning in ways that do not, at this moment, constitute an overt act of naval warfare, but that change the risk calculation of every commercial vessel in the theater instantaneously and irreversibly. Stay with me, because the simultaneity is not incidental. The simultaneity is the strategy. What I need you to see, and this is the layer that the headline cannot capture, is that Iran has not simply launched more weapons. Iran has launched a cognitive overload against the decision architecture of the opposing side. 230 drones and 310 missiles generate a specific military problem. 230 drones, 310 missiles, and an active maritime repositioning that threatens the strait simultaneously generate a decision problem of a categorically different order. One that requires the defending side's political and military leadership to allocate attention, resources, and response options across domains that are competing with each other for priority in real time, with incomplete information, under electronic interference, and against a timeline that Iran controls. Washington is watching all of this happen, and Washington cannot decide fast enough. That is not an accusation. It is a structural fact about how the American national security decision process operates under conditions of genuine multi-domain simultaneous pressure. And it is the fact that this entire Iranian operation was designed around. Let me take you into the opening sequence of this strike with the granular attention it deserves. The drone wave deploys in the pattern that is becoming recognizable in this fictional scenario's escalation arc. Multiple axes, dispersed launch points, mixed payloads, designed to force defensive system engagement across the broadest possible coverage front while concealing which contacts carry warheads and which carry sensors and which carry electronic payloads. The lower-tier air defense batteries begin their engagement sequences. The intercept rate is high. The expenditure rate is higher than the replenishment rate. The mathematics of this exchange are, as in every engagement of this architecture, negative for the defending side from the first interceptor fired. But something is different in this engagement. The drone wave is not calibrated to maximize the air defense expenditure rate alone. It is calibrated to maximize the air defense expenditure rate while simultaneously drawing the attention and the electronic emissions of every radar system in the theater away from the maritime picture. The drones are not just a threat to the air domain, they are a diversion from the sea domain. And while every radar operator, every command center display, every allocated piece of intelligence collection bandwidth in the theater is oriented toward the 230 contacts arriving overhead, the maritime repositioning in the strait is happening against a surveillance picture that is measurably less complete than it was 60 minutes ago. This is the design beneath the design, and it is only visible if you are watching both pictures simultaneously, which is exactly what the Iranian strike architecture is making it structurally difficult to do. The 310 missiles arrive in the sequenced, layered architecture that this scenario's earlier engagements have established as doctrinal pattern. First wave: force commitment of upper-tier interceptors. Second wave: arrive while the mid-tier is already engaged managing the drone overflow. Third wave: timed against the specific moment when the magazine arithmetic on the defending side has reached the depth at which coverage gaps begin to open. The engagement is not a single event. It is a sustained, precisely timed pressure campaign against a defensive architecture that is performing at its design limits and beginning to show the systemic strain that design limit performance inevitably produces. And simultaneously, this word is the key to everything in this scenario, simultaneously, in the Gulf, something is happening that the international community has not seen before in this conflict. Something that changes every calculation about what this engagement actually is. I want to stop here for a moment and widen the lens. Because the framing that most people will apply to what they are seeing, 230 drones, 310 missiles, large attack, serious damage, is the wrong frame. It will lead you to the wrong conclusions about what this scenario means and what follows from it. The right frame is this. What Iran has launched in this fictional scenario is not a strike. It is a simultaneity event. A simultaneity event is a specific kind of strategic action in which the objective is not to destroy any particular target, but to exceed the processing capacity of the opposing decision architecture across more dimensions at once than that architecture was designed to handle. The value of a simultaneity event is not measured in the damage it causes. It is measured in the decisions it prevents. The responses that cannot be authorized because the authorization process is saturated. The countermeasures that cannot be coordinated because the coordination channels are overwhelmed. The strategic options that cannot be exercised because the leaders who must authorize them are simultaneously receiving demands for decisions that compete with each other for the same finite pool of executive attention. 310 missiles and 230 drones, launched against an already stressed air defense architecture, would be a serious military problem. 310 missiles and 230 drones, launched simultaneously with a maritime activation that threatens the Strait of Hormuz. In a context where the American decision architecture must decide, simultaneously, what to do about all three, while managing the political expectations of the alliance framework that is watching every decision and the global markets that are pricing every signal. That is a simultaneity event, and simultaneity events do not just impose military costs, they impose decision costs. And decision costs, in a conflict of this nature, are the most strategically consequential costs of all. Ask yourself what the National Security Council looks like right now, inside this scenario. Ask yourself what the agenda of the emergency session looks like when it contains the air engagement assessment, the maritime threat picture, the energy market shock, the alliance communication requirements, and the domestic political situation, all demanding resolution in the same window of executive time. Ask yourself which of those agenda items gets the depth of attention it requires. Ask yourself which gets handled with less precision than the situation warrants because the other items are also urgent and also consequence-laden and also waiting. The answer to that question is where the real damage of this scenario lives. Not in the craters. In the decisions that were not made well enough, fast enough, or with enough information because the simultaneous pressure of a multi-domain attack made making them well impossible. There is a layer beneath the simultaneity that I have not yet brought you into, and I need to, because it is the layer that carries the heaviest long-term strategic weight of everything we are watching. The maritime activation in this scenario is not, at this moment, an act of naval warfare in the conventional sense. Iranian vessels have not fired on commercial shipping. The strait has not been declared closed. The explicit legal and operational threshold that would trigger the specific alliance response commitments that the American security architecture has built around the defense of Gulf shipping has not been crossed. What has happened is something more strategically sophisticated and more difficult to respond to. Iran has repositioned assets in a manner that makes the risk of transit through the strait genuinely uncertain. Uncertain enough that commercial operators must price that uncertainty into their decisions, but not so explicitly threatening that it triggers the specific response framework that a declared blockade would generate. This is the maritime version of the same doctrinal logic that governs the air campaign. The objective is not to impose costs through direct action. The objective is to generate uncertainty at a level that changes behavior without triggering the specific response thresholds that a more direct action would produce. The shipping companies that are now holding their vessels in anchorage positions outside the Gulf do not need Iran to fire a single shot at them to be affected. They need only the uncertainty. The uncertainty is enough to stop the movement. And stop movement in the Strait of Hormuz produces the same global economic consequence as a physically enforced closure, at a fraction of the political and military cost. This is the second layer. The maritime front is not active in the sense of kinetic naval engagement. It is active in the sense of commercial behavior modification through strategic uncertainty. And commercial behavior modification through strategic uncertainty, the stopping of tankers, the repricing of insurance, the rerouting of vessels, the hold orders from shipping companies responding to risk assessments that now reflect a fundamentally different Gulf security environment, produces global economic effects that the military toolkit of the opposing side cannot easily reverse. You cannot sink a risk premium. You cannot intercept an actuarial reassessment. And Iran has just produced both, simultaneously, at the cost of repositioning naval assets that have not yet fired a shot. Let me be direct about what this means for Washington, because Washington is now managing not just a military crisis, but a commercial crisis embedded inside a military crisis. And the tools available for managing those two crises are different enough that using both simultaneously, coherently, without the interventions contradicting each other, is an institutional challenge that the American national security architecture has not been tested on at this specific combination of scale and speed. I want to take you back into the architecture of Iranian strategic preparation for this scenario, because the simultaneity event we are watching did not emerge from a decision made in the last 48 hours. It emerged from a planning process that identified the simultaneity itself as the strategic objective years before this engagement began. Iran's military doctrine, as rendered in this fictional scenario, has undergone a specific evolution over the past decade that most outside analysts have consistently underweighted in their assessments. The evolution is from a doctrine of deterrence through threat, the posture of holding things at risk to prevent action, to a doctrine of deterrence through demonstrated capability, the posture of actually deploying the capabilities that were previously only threatened, in order to revise the opposing side's assessment of what Iran can execute, and thereby establish a new deterrence baseline from a position of demonstrated strength rather than declared intention. The air component of this evolution is visible and has been discussed. The maritime component is less understood, and it is the one that carries the most transformative long-term implications. Iran has spent years developing what strategic analysts in this scenario's fictional world refer to as the maritime ambiguity doctrine. The use of naval and maritime militia assets not to fight and win naval engagements, but to generate the specific quality of strategic uncertainty in commercial and naval traffic that produces the same economic and political effects as a direct naval blockade without incurring the response that a direct naval blockade would trigger. The Strait of Hormuz, in this doctrine, is not a target to be physically closed. It is a variable to be continuously adjusted, opened slightly, narrowed, widened, made uncertain, made less uncertain, in a manner that gives Iran continuous leverage over the global economic consequences of the conflict without ever fully committing to the action that would trigger the specific response mechanism that American alliance architecture has built around strait defense. The drone program that produces 230 simultaneous deployable platforms in this scenario is the product of exactly the same doctrinal thinking applied to the air domain. The objective is not to overwhelm the defense with a mass of individually lethal platforms. The objective is to generate uncertainty density, a cloud of contacts of varying type and capability that forces the defending architecture to treat every contact as potentially lethal, and therefore to commit interceptor resources against the cloud rather than against the specific lethal platforms embedded within it. The drone is, in this doctrine, primarily an instrument of uncertainty generation rather than an instrument of direct destruction. Its military value is proportional not to its own destructive capacity, but to the interceptor expenditure and command attention it forces from the defending side. The missile program builds on this foundation with a payload delivery capability that does not require the defense to be completely overwhelmed, only sufficiently uncertain to achieve its objectives. When the radar picture is degraded by jamming, when the track correlation is complicated by the drone cloud, when the command bandwidth is consumed by the requirement to simultaneously process air threats and maritime signals, and political communications and alliance coordination requirements, the precision engagement rate of even the best air defense system in the world begins to decline. And every percentage point of decline in the engagement rate across 310 inbound rounds represents targets reached. The architecture of patience that underlies all of this is the most important and the least visible element of Iranian strategy in this scenario. Every capability on display tonight was built over years of disciplined investment made against a backdrop of severe economic constraint, international isolation, and sustained military pressure. The temptation, for any institution operating under those conditions, is to accelerate, to deploy what has been built before it is fully mature, before the doctrine for its use has been refined, before the operational coordination between its components has been stress-tested to the level that operational execution requires. Iran, in this fictional scenario, did not accelerate. It waited. And the waiting, the patient, disciplined, strategically controlled waiting, is why what we are watching tonight is working. The American and Allied forces in this scenario are not paralyzed. I want to be precise about that, because the narrative of paralysis is too simple and too misleading to be useful. The naval assets in the theater are repositioning. The air defense architecture is engaging. The alliance communication channels are active. The response is happening. The response is happening too slowly. And the reason it is happening too slowly is not a failure of capability or will. It is a structural consequence of the specific multi-domain, simultaneous pressure that Iran has designed this engagement to generate. The American naval presence in the Gulf and the broader theater is formidable. Carrier strike group assets, surface combatants, submarine capability, maritime patrol aviation. The hardware of American naval power in this region is extensive and sophisticated. But naval power, like air defense capability, is subject to the same fundamental constraint that governs every aspect of the defending side situation in this scenario. It was configured for a threat environment that looked different from what Iran has just revealed. The carrier strike group operating in this theater was positioned against a threat assessment that assigned Iranian naval engagement capability a specific profile: aggressive, but bounded by the responding side's ability to escalate to a level of conventional naval dominance that Iran could not match. That assessment was not wrong. Iran cannot match American carrier aviation in a symmetric naval engagement. The assessment was wrong about what Iran intends to do. Iran does not intend to fight a symmetric naval engagement. Iran intends to generate the maritime uncertainty event that we are watching unfold in the Strait, absorb the response it triggers, and then demonstrate, through the sustained nature of the uncertainty rather than through any single kinetic act, that the cost of maintaining the free flow of commercial traffic through the Strait is higher, more sustained, and more politically complex than the American political system was prepared to authorize. The political hesitation dimension of the opposing side's strain is critical and deserves its own accounting. Every escalatory response option available to the American and Allied command in this theater requires political authorization from a capital that is managing a domestic situation that has its own pressures. The energy price shock that is already propagating through the global economy is not an abstract geopolitical event for the populations of the democracies that are supposed to be managing the crisis response. It is a price at a gas station. It is an electricity bill. It is a cost of living impact that translates into political pressure on the governments whose military authorizations are needed for the response options being considered. And that political pressure, the domestic economic pressure produced by the maritime component of this scenario, is a constraint on the military response to the air component of this scenario,
even though they look like separate events.
They are not separate events. They are the same event, seen from different angles. That integration, the integration of military pressure and economic consequence, into a single strategic instrument designed to constrain the opposing side's political freedom of action, is the architecturally important feature of what Iran has built in this scenario. And it is working. The engagement is now in its fourth hour, and the escalation picture is expanding in every direction faster than any single actor in the international system can fully process. The air defense expenditure has reached a level that is generating serious concern among the commanders responsible for managing the remaining magazine depth against the threat profile that remains in the field. The drone wave has not fully resolved. Residual platforms are still active, still requiring tracking and engagement decisions. And the missile exchange has consumed interceptor rounds at a rate that the replenishment logistics of this theater cannot fully address before the window in which a follow-on salvo could arrive. The defending side is managing the aftermath of this engagement against the constant strategic awareness that the aftermath and the next phase are not separated by a comfortable interval of reconstitution time. The maritime picture has deteriorated in the way that the strategic uncertainty doctrine predicts. Commercial shipping, which had been maintaining transit operations through the strait against a risk premium that reflected the pre-engagement threat assessment, is now suspended. Not because Iran has fired on any vessel, not because any transit has been physically blocked, because the risk assessment has been revised upward by the repositioning of Iranian naval and maritime militia assets to a level at which the commercial insurance market, the shipping company risk officers, and the vessel captains themselves have independently concluded that transit is no longer an acceptable operational decision until the strategic picture clarifies. The clarification they are waiting for, the signal that the strait is safe to transit, cannot come from a military engagement alone. It requires a political resolution of the crisis that is occurring between governments in the channels that operate on political timelines rather than military ones. And the political timeline is measured in days and weeks, not in the hours during which the physical maritime risk will remain elevated. The tankers are not moving. They will not move until the political situation permits a credible reassessment of the maritime risk environment. And every day they do not move. The global energy supply picture deteriorates in ways that generate their own political pressures on governments that are simultaneously trying to manage the military crisis.